I spent my whole life remembering his eyes, but I never knew his name. And when I finally found out where he was, it was too late to tell him I loved him. And the strangest thing is that, even though we never spoke about love, every silence between us said more than any promise. But there's something I never told you about our last meeting. My name is Inez Coraline Dubois. I have 90 years, and I live alone in New Orleans, Louisiana. From my apartment's balcony, the wrought iron railings still hold the salty smell of the river, mingled with the scent of the white curtains moving in the wind. This is where I spend my days, listening to the creak of the rocking chair and the distant echo of footsteps that never arrive. When I close my eyes, I return to a place where the air was heavy with ether, blood, and smoke. I was young, with hands that trembled but were steady enough to hold a life. Back then I wore the stained white of war nurses and learned early on that there were pains that couldn't be cured with bandages. I served in a makeshift field hospital, set up between tarps and wooden walls that creaked with every gust of wind. War didn't ask who you were. It simply decided whether you stayed or left. I stayed. I stayed to clean wounds that weren't mine, to hold hands I didn't recognize, to hear names that, often, would never be repeated. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see short white curls, weather-beaten skin, and red-tinted lips, as if the color were capable of holding something alive within me. But inside me, there's still the young woman who, one night, met a pair of eyes that would follow her for the rest of her life, without ever hearing her name. And it's this story I need to talk about, because it never left me, even when I tried to forget it. If you enjoy stories kept for decades, of loves that survive only in memory, stay with me until the end. Subscribe to the channel and join the group that doesn't let memories like this fade away. The smell of that field hospital never left me. It was a dense, almost palpable air that clung to my skin and clothes, as if it wanted to live there forever. It mingled with the ether of the makeshift operating tables, the iron of dried blood, the sweat of men who hadn't slept in days, and the faint scent of damp wood from the rickety walls. At first, I thought it was something I'd get used to. But the truth is, you don't. You just learn to breathe more slowly, as if that way you could filter out the horror before it enters your lungs whole. The stretchers lay side by side, separated only by torn cloths hanging from ropes. The voices were low, as if even war were afraid to hear. I walked among bandaged bodies, some moaning, others so still that the question of what remained of them was only answered when someone came to cover them with a sheet. My feet sank gently into the packed earth, and each step felt like a reminder that we were only inches above nothing. It was in one of those narrow corridors that I first saw him. I can't say why I noticed him. Perhaps because, unlike the others, his eyes were open and followed me, even when I wasn't looking back. They were steady, almost impertinent eyes, but there was something in them that wasn't a challenge. It was recognition, as if he already knew me from some impossible place. I was carrying a metal basin, filled with instruments still damp from the last treatment. He was lying down, a makeshift bandage on his arm, and a soldier beside me simply said to me, "Take care of him, but don't ask questions." That sentence stuck in my throat like a splinter. Not asking meant not knowing, and not knowing was the only way to avoid getting involved. At least, that's what I told myself every night. But the truth is, I was already involved from the moment our eyes met. I remember how the noise of the other calls seemed to fade, as if all sound had been sucked away, leaving only the low sound of his breathing. That day was the beginning of something that had no name, and perhaps never would. Among so many people I passed through, he was the only one who seemed to look at me as if he knew I, too, carried invisible wounds. I didn't know who he was, where he came from, or why I was there. I only knew that the hospital smell, heavy and almost unbearable, took on a new detail that afternoon. The almost imperceptible scent of apple coming from who knows where. To this day, when I smell ether, it's as if it returns, silently, to find me. But that night, as I was organizing gauze and scalpels for the next shift, I never imagined that this unknown would take root within me for decades. And yet, little did I know that a simple piece of cloth on his arm held a secret I would never forget. The next shift, when I returned to check his dressings, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. On his arm, just above the blood-stained bandage, was tied a piece of blue fabric. It wasn't part of his military uniform. It had no insignia, no numbers, nor the texture of the armbands used to identify platoons. It was just a worn patch with misaligned embroidery, as if someone, without much skill, had threaded the needle more out of desperation to make a statement than out of aesthetic whim. The bloodstains had darkened the original blue in spots, creating an irregular pattern that made me think of the sky and storms. I reached out to release him, thinking it might impede circulation. But before I could touch him, he grabbed my wrist. It wasn't a brusque gesture, but a firm one, filled with a silent plea. His eyes spoke volumes. I understood that the cloth was more than just a scrap of fabric. It was something he couldn't, or wouldn't, lose. It was at that moment that the soldier in charge of the bed approached, and in a low, almost whispered voice, said, "Don't ask questions about this." This phrase echoed for the second time since I had met him, and each repetition seemed to build a higher wall between us. I simply nodded, but inside my curiosity twisted. Who had given him that handkerchief? What did those hastily embroidered lines mean? Why, amidst so much loss, did he protect it as if it were his last anchor? I continued cleaning his wounds carefully, avoiding disturbing the cloth. As I ran the damp cloth over his arm, I felt the feverish heat of his skin and noticed how, even weakened, he kept his hand closed around the cloth when I approached. It was an instinctive act, like someone who, even in sleep, holds tightly to a cherished object. At night, I lay on the makeshift bunk in the nurses' quarters and imagined stories for that blue patch. Maybe it was from a uniform from another army. Maybe it was a memento of someone he'd loved. Or perhaps it was a token of belonging to something forbidden, which would explain the silence around him. In the darkness, the sounds of war outside seemed distant. But inside me, the sound of the fabric brushing against his skin was so present that it kept me awake. The next morning when I returned to the hospital, he was awake, peering through the opening in the canvas that served as a wall. The morning light was dim, but it illuminated the blue of the cloth in an almost poetic way, as if the sun knew it needed to be noticed. And in that moment I realized that, of all the things I couldn't ask, that would be the one that would torment me the most. What I didn't know is that, much later, that same handkerchief would return to my hands, and with it, answers that I perhaps would rather not have. For the next few days I didn't hear a single word come out of his mouth. The field hospital was always immersed in a constant hum of murmurs, groans, and medical orders. But his silence had a weight of its own, dense, almost physical, as if it filled the entire space around him. I'd approach with the tray of bandages, and he'd simply follow me with his gaze, as if my every move were carefully recorded. It was a silence unlike that of the wounded who lacked the strength to speak. His seemed deliberate, as if words were a luxury he couldn't afford. And in a way, I began to respect this silent pact. I also learned to respond without speaking. A look to indicate I needed him to turn his arm, a light touch on the shoulder to let him know I was going to change the bandage. A discreet nod to ask if he was in pain. He understood every gesture, and I understood every silent response. I remember one afternoon when the rain pounded hard against the hospital tarpaulin. The humidity penetrated everything: clothes, walls, skin. I was changing the bandage on his arm, and for a moment, our eyes met in a way that made me forget the pressure of time. Outside, muffled shouts and hurried footsteps scurried through muddy puddles. But inside, it seemed like only that moment existed. It was as if the entire world had contracted to fit into the narrow space between us. There were questions that burned my tongue. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why that blue scarf? But every time the urge to ask threatened to overcome me, I remembered the words I'd been told. Don't ask questions. And strangely, I realized I was beginning to accept that limit. Perhaps because deep down, I feared the answer. This silence between us began to transform into something more intimate than any conversation. It wasn't just the words that stuck. It was the feelings, too. Sometimes when I left my shift and walked past his bedside, I felt as if he followed me with his gaze until I disappeared, and that stayed with me for hours, like an invisible mark. Today, so many years later, I realized that it was during this period that something began to change within me. Because of all the voices I heard during the war, the one that resonated the most was precisely the one I never heard. And perhaps that's why, when I finally touched her face for the first time, that absence of words became the most intense sound I've ever experienced. The first time I touched his face, it was almost without thinking. I was used to wiping dust and sweat off soldiers, but with him, it was different. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just physical, as if his soul was exhausted too. I wet the cloth with warm water, and as I ran it over his skin, I felt his eyes slowly close, as if receiving a long-awaited gesture. In that environment, touch had rules. Everything was quick, functional, impersonal. We nurses learned to maintain emotional distance, to treat each soldier as a patient, not as a person with a history and fragilities. But with him, my gesture departed from protocol. I didn't just clean his face. I lingered there a few seconds longer, following the contours of his cheekbones, feeling the roughness of his scraggly beard, the heat of his still feverish skin. He said nothing, as always, but his body responded. His breathing slowed, the muscles in his shoulders relaxed, and there was a barely perceptible expression, a half-smile that seemed to fade before it even existed. War stole almost every moment of humanity, and I realized this might be one of the few he had left. I, in turn, felt a different weight in my chest. It was dangerous to feel too much there. Attachment could be cruel, because there was no guarantee that the face you saw today would be there tomorrow. But as much as I tried to convince myself it was just a technicality, I knew there was something more to that gesture, something that drew me closer to him, even when duty dictated keeping my distance. On the night shift, while adjusting his sheets, my hand accidentally brushed against his. It wasn't a squeeze or a calculated gesture, just a brief brush of skin against skin. Still, he turned his palm upward, as if offering my hand a place to rest. I pulled back, perhaps too quickly, and continued working, pretending nothing had happened. But deep inside me, that feeling was etched like a soft scar, impossible to erase. Today, decades later, I understand that at that moment we began to create a language of our own. A language made of small gestures, long enough to be felt, but brief enough not to attract attention. It was a forbidden language, but it said more about us than any conversation. And it was one morning while I was changing his bandages that this silent language gained an unexpected sound, the distant sound of bells. It was dawn, and the field hospital was plunged into that twilight known only to war, when silence isn't peace, but a tense pause, as if the world were holding its breath. I moved carefully, avoiding waking those groaning in their sleep, changing bandages under the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Then, in the distance, a strange sound pierced the night. Bells. They weren't church bells calling for mass, nor festive chimes. They had a deeper, slower, almost funereal tone. It was a sound that seemed to come from far away, yet at the same time echoed deep within my chest. I stopped, instinctively, and looked at him. He, too, had stopped breathing deeply. He was now staring fixedly at some invisible point above me. I continued my work, running the clean gauze over his arm. But I felt his hand tighten around mine. It wasn't a gesture of pain, nor of fear. It was something more instinctive, as if he recognized that sound and wanted to anchor himself to me, so as not to sink into the memory. His eyes, as silent as ever, seemed darker in the dim light, reflecting some memory I couldn't reach. I wanted to ask what it meant, but the "don't ask questions" rule seemed to scream inside my head. So I just stood there, holding his hand, as the bells continued their slow call. When they stopped, the silence grew even heavier, as if the sound had carried something with it and left a void in the air. It was that night that I realized there were things about him I might never have known, invisible marks that the sound of those bells seemed to awaken, and strangely, it didn't push me away. On the contrary, it made me almost painfully want to be someone who could stand beside him, even without understanding everything. When I finished bandaging him, he didn't immediately let go of my hand. We stayed like that for a few seconds, staring at each other, until a call in the background forced me to pull away. As I walked down the narrow hallway, I felt the warmth of that hand still linger in mine. At the time, I didn't know it. But I would soon encounter something that would put me in a dilemma and make me choose between obeying orders or following my heart. It was on a muggy morning when the air seemed too heavy even to breathe that I found the letter. I was checking the pockets of his uniform for anything that might interfere with changing his dressings. A common, almost mechanical procedure. Between a crumpled handkerchief and a loose button, my fingers touched the outline of an envelope. The paper was crumpled, damp at the edges, as if it had been carried against my body for a long time. In the corner, handwritten, was a woman's name that wasn't mine. The handwriting was hurried, almost shaky, but there was a care in the letters that made me wonder who could have written them. I felt a strange pang in my chest. It wasn't jealousy exactly, but something close, a discomfort I didn't want to admit. I shouldn't have opened it. And I didn't. The seal was worn, but intact. Still, I stood there, holding that letter, feeling it held more than ink and paper. The right thing to do would have been to hand it over to the officer in charge. That was the norm. Everything we found belonged to us only until it was registered. But for some reason I couldn't explain. My feet didn't move. I put the envelope back in my pocket, adjusted the cloth over the wound, and pretended I hadn't seen anything. Maybe it was obedience. After all, not asking questions also meant not touching what wasn't mine. But deep down, I think it was selfish. I spent the rest of the day thinking about that letter. Who was it? What had he told her? And more than that, why had he carried it around in the chaos, risking loss or damage? Every time I went back to change the bandage, my eyes searched for the volume in my pocket. And there it was, unmoving, as if it were part of him. That night, in the barracks, I heard one of the doctors talking in the distance about letters that never reached their recipients, lost along the way, or held back for strategic reasons. This made me wonder if that letter, even if delivered, would have any chance of reaching the woman it was written to. And for the first time, I realized that perhaps I didn't want it to arrive. It wasn't about possession, but about preserving what I felt was ours, even if there was no defined us. I never spoke about it to anyone. The letter remained with him, untouched, until the day he passed away. And to this day, when I think about it, I feel that the weight I carried at that moment was much greater than a simple piece of paper. And perhaps that's why, when he offered me half an apple a few days later, I understood that that gesture, simple and silent, said more than any word that could be written on that envelope. It was on a sultry afternoon, when the sun seemed to push the heat against the canvas walls, that he did something that took me by surprise. I was rearranging the tray with clean gauze and vials of ether when I noticed him watching me with a look that wasn't one of pain or fatigue. It was as if he were waiting for the right moment. With a slow movement, he took a small apple from his pocket, its skin marked and slightly dented, and split it in half with his hands. He said nothing. He simply held out the smaller piece to me. The gesture, coming from anyone else, might have been banal. But here, amidst the scarcity and haste, sharing food was more than an act of kindness. It was giving up something one might otherwise need. I looked at the half he offered me and hesitated. Part of me wanted to refuse, lest I create an even more dangerous bond. Another part knew that if I didn't accept, I would be denying the silent language we'd been building since day one. I took the apple. The flesh was warm, imbued with the warmth of his hands. I bit into it slowly, tasting it sweet and tart at the same time, as if it held something I wasn't ready to name. He bit into his half too, but his eyes remained fixed on me, as if the true exchange wasn't in the food, but in the act of sharing the moment. For a few seconds, the noise of the hospital faded. There were no shouts, no orders, no hurried footsteps. There was only the sound of our breathing and the soft crunch of the fruit being bitten. I felt that, in that silence, it told me more than any promise I'd ever made in my life, that, however brief, that moment was ours. I tucked the apple stem into my apron pocket. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to keep proof that it had happened, that even in the midst of war, there were small gestures that could sustain someone for a lifetime. Years later, I still remember the smell of the apple mixed with ether and end-of-shift sweat, an unlikely blend that somehow became my secret memory scent. But the war didn't allow us to live in those moments for long. A few days later, I received news that he was being transferred, and along with the order came the recommendation to avoid any contact on the day of his departure. What they didn't know is that after receiving that apple, there was no order in the world that could stop me from watching him leave. The news arrived the way bad news does in war, without warning, without context, without explanation. I was changing a soldier's bandage in the next wing when the sergeant entered and called me over with a curt gesture. He said, in a tone that brooked no reply, that this man, the one with the blue scarf, the one with the silences, the one with the broken apple, would be transferred to another unit for safety. He didn't explain from whom or what. He simply reinforced, keep your distance, avoid any contact that day. I felt the weight of those words as if they'd pushed a block of ice into my chest. For safety's sake could mean many things. That he was in danger, or that he was the danger. But what hurt wasn't the doubt. It was the certainty that, in a few hours, that gaze that had accompanied me every day would disappear among strangers, taken to a place where I would never find it. I continued my shift as if nothing had changed, but every time I passed his bedside, I felt my stomach churn. He knew. He didn't ask me anything, as if he sensed I had no answers, but his eyes held a kind of silent farewell, By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the hospital seemed heavier. I don't know if it was my distorted perception, or if everyone there also felt the invisible cut of an announced absence. I spent the night awake, listening to the wind blow against the tent's canvas, imagining what the next day would be like. I thought about the little things he would leave behind. The scent of the apple, the blue patch, the sluggish breath as I wiped his face. I didn't want those memories to end like endless chapters. On the morning of his departure, I did as I was told. I avoided passing by his wing. I kept my hands busy, my eyes downcast, as if work could shield me from feeling. But deep down, a decision had already been made. I wouldn't allow him to be taken away without at least one last look. And so it was that, a few hours later, I found myself standing behind one of the makeshift wooden gates, hidden in shadows and dust, waiting for the moment he would pass. I didn't know what I would do when I saw him, whether I would say something, or just stare. All I knew was that I needed to be there. What I didn't imagine is that that last meeting wouldn't be an ordinary goodbye, but a gesture so simple and full of meaning that it would remain engraved in my memory forever. The camp gate stood half open, propped up by a makeshift piece of wood. Fine dust rose from the ground with each hurried step of the soldiers, and the air carried that mingled smell of smoke and metal that seemed to accompany all military deployments. I hid behind a stack of crates, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid someone would hear. And then he appeared. He walked slowly, not out of weakness, though he was still recovering, but as if he knew each step took him away from something he didn't want to let go of. The blue scarf was still tied around his arm, stained and faded. He passed close enough for me to smell that subtle apple scent, now a part of my memory. Just as he was about to climb into the truck, he paused for a moment. His eyes darted around as if searching for something, or someone. I don't know how, but he found me in the shadows. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stared. And that look held everything we hadn't had the time or permission to say. Then, almost instinctively, he reached into his coat pocket and touched the rounded shape I recognized immediately. The other half of the apple. Perhaps it wasn't the same one. Certainly it couldn't be any more. But the gesture told me he carried it somehow, whether in his pocket or in his memory. The driver shouted a curt order, and he climbed into the truck. The tarp was lowered, and the engine began to roar. I stood there, motionless, watching the dust engulf the vehicle until nothing remained but wind and silence. There was no hug, no words, just that last look, which became both my farewell and my inheritance. I returned to my dorm without speaking to anyone. I washed my hands as usual, but the smell of dust mixed with apples seemed to linger on my skin, as if reminding me that some things can't be washed away with soap and water. That night, I wrote a letter. I didn't know his full name, I didn't know where he'd been taken, but I wrote anyway, and with it, I planted the unlikely hope that maybe, somewhere, he might write me back. What I didn't know is that this letter would travel alone through time, and when fate crossed it with him, it would only be to show me that, sometimes, answers arrive too late. I wrote that letter as if speaking in an empty room, but still hoping to be heard. I began without knowing what to call him. There was no name, just a memory made of silences and gestures. I described the field hospital, the rainy nights, the blue handkerchief, the broken apple. I told him things I'd never told anyone, as if paper could hold secrets without judging them. I didn't write to get answers. I wrote to let him know that, even though he was gone, he had left something alive in me, fold by fold. I tried to put on paper the voice we never had. When I finished, the envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried everything I couldn't say in person. The next day, I took the letter to the military post office. I handed it to the sergeant in charge, who looked at the envelope and, without looking up at me, stamped it and put it in a pile with many others. I left with the strange feeling that I had left a piece of myself in the hands of someone who didn't understand its value. The months passed. I continued my routine of appointments, trying to occupy my mind so as not to wait for something that might never come. But waiting is treacherous. It creeps into the body without asking permission. Every time the mail arrived, my heart raced, even when I told myself I wasn't expecting anything. Then one day, years after the war ended, I heard a story. A nurse who had worked in another unit told me that she had once seen a man carefully putting away a yellowed envelope, without even opening it. She couldn't remember his face, but she described a detail that made me stop breathing. The envelope had my handwriting on it. I had that image in my head for days. Was it him? Why didn't he open it? Was it by choice or impossibility? The questions swirled like dry leaves in the wind, never finding ground to land. This uncertainty haunted me for years. And perhaps it was this lack of response that kept his memory alive within me. Because when there's no endpoint, the story continues to breathe, even if only within one person. And so it was that, much later, an unlikely reunion awaited me. Not face to face, but in the yellowed pages of a newspaper, where I saw that look again, now aged and silent forever. It was an ordinary morning in New Orleans. The coffee was still steaming in the cup, and I was leafing through the newspaper unhurriedly, as I've done since age forced me to slow down. The news flashed before my eyes like the scenery on a slow train, until a photograph stopped everything. The face in the image wasn't exactly the same as I remembered. Time had left deep marks, lines I didn't recognize, and the hair was now mostly white. But the eyes were the same. The ones that followed me into the field hospital, that held my silence and offered me half an apple. The caption said he had died recently, with no known family, and that local veterans would pay their respects. No mention of his origins, no details about his life between the day he passed and that lonely end. Just a name that meant nothing to me, as if it were a disguise or a second chapter written far from me. I gripped the newspaper tighter, trying to absorb every trace of that photo, as if I could tear it from the page and keep it with me. The coffee went cold, the rest of the news faded, and I stood there, staring at his face as if before a broken mirror, reflecting 2 times at once, that of the young nurse who had met him, and that of the elderly woman who finally knew where he was. Too late. The pain I felt wasn't that of a recent loss, but of an old wound that, even when closed, bleeds when touched. I didn't cry. I just sat still, with the newspaper open on the table, as if any movement could undo that reunion. And in that moment I realized that something of mine had also been buried along with him. Not because love had died, but because now there was no longer the possibility, not even an illusory one, of a real reunion. But fate still had one last twist in store. Years after that silent morning, a broken object in my drawer would rekindle memories I thought were untouched. It was one afternoon, while tidying my bedroom dresser, that I saw it again. Not in a photograph, but in the memory an object held. Opening the bottom drawer, among old handkerchiefs and yellowed letters, I found my necklace of colorful beads. Broken. The beads were scattered like small memories rolling across the wooden bottom, and for a moment I was breathless. It was the same necklace I wore in the field hospital, the day he held the back of my neck to thank me. I remember it perfectly. I had just adjusted his pillow, and in an unexpected gesture his hand rose to the base of my neck. It wasn't a squeeze nor an invasive touch. It was as if he needed to confirm that I was there, real, alive, and not just a passing figure. At that moment, the beads of the necklace brushed against his skin, and I heard the soft sound of the beads moving, like a gentle rain. Now, decades later, that same necklace was broken. I couldn't remember wearing it recently, nor letting it fall into disrepair. The colorful beads, which had once seemed vibrant, were worn, their shine diminished. I held a few in the palm of my hand and closed my eyes. It was as if their weight brought back to my skin the warmth of his hand that day. I couldn't help but think that perhaps it had broken on the same day I learned of his death. An absurd coincidence, but one my mind, starved for meaning, accepted without resistance. The necklace, like me, bore the mark of something broken beyond repair. I put the bills back in the drawer, but kept one separate, in the little box where I keep things I can't explain why I still keep. Maybe it was a way to keep him close. Maybe it was just another piece of me trying not to disappear completely. And it was shortly after that the past knocked on my door. Not as a memory, but as someone alive, bringing with it proof that my story with it was not over. It was late afternoon when there was a knock on my door. The sun was already setting behind the old New Orleans buildings, and the white curtains on the porch moved lazily in the warm breeze. I opened it without expecting anyone, and was met with a young man, his gaze attentive and his posture respectful, as if he were stepping into a sacred place. He was holding a crumpled envelope in his hands, but it was what he said first that made my heart skip a beat. "Are you Inez Coraline Dubois? My grandfather spoke of a nurse with amber skin and a colorful necklace, but I never knew her name." I stood for a few seconds without responding, feeling the air around me change in density. His face told me nothing, but there was something in the way he looked at me, as if trying to see an entire story through me. I asked him to come in. We sat in the living room, and he, with almost ceremonial care, removed an object wrapped in thin paper from the envelope. When he opened it, I saw what seemed impossible: a blue cloth handkerchief with dark stains and sloppy embroidery. My hands trembled as I touched it. The fabric was more fragile, but it still had that irregular pattern I'd never forgotten. I ran my fingers along the stitching lines like someone reading a letter in Braille, and felt that each stitch was the beat of a heart that no longer existed. "He kept it to himself his whole life," the boy said. "And he said there were things that couldn't be forgotten, even if no one else understood." I couldn't answer. I just closed my eyes for a moment, feeling as if all the time between that hospital and that moment had folded in on itself. It was as if he were there again, sitting before me, silently, offering not an apple, but an entire memory. When I opened my eyes again, I realized there was still more inside the envelope. The young man handed me a small package, saying I might want to see it. I had no idea that inside was something that would not only confirm my presence in his life, but also reveal that he had, somehow, always carried my image. The boy held out the small package, and for a moment my hands hesitated. The wrapping paper was yellowed and soft, as if it had been handled countless times. I opened it carefully, and inside I found an old photograph, already faded at the edges. At first, my eyes searched for his face, and there it was, right in the center of the frame, sitting on a makeshift stretcher, a blue bandana tied around his arm. But that wasn't what made me hold my breath. In the background, out of focus, almost hidden by the blurry movement of other soldiers and nurses, was me. I carried a tray of bandages, my hair hastily tied back, the beaded necklace around my neck. I had no idea that moment had been captured. There were never photographers roaming freely in the hospital, at least not in front of my eyes. But here was proof that, at some point, Someone had pressed the shutter and captured not just him, but the two of us, connected by that accidental frame. I held the photo with my fingertips, as if it were too fragile for my hand to fully grasp. A part of me wondered how many times he'd looked at this image throughout his life. Did he search for me in the blurry background every time? Did he remember the scent of ether and apple mingled? Or was the mere fact of having me there even blurred enough to keep him connected to something no one else knew? The boy explained that he had found the photograph, tucked away among a few other things his grandfather had left behind. He said he didn't know why it was important, but he felt compelled to give it to me. I wanted to thank him, but the words were lost between my throat and my lips. I simply placed the photo on my lap and stared, letting it draw me back into that narrow hallway, into that silent exchange that never needed an explanation. But as I stared at that image, I realized there was a void it didn't fill. His name. I knew everything about his gestures, the weight of his silence, but I didn't know the word the world used to call him. And that's how I reached the last chapter of this story, the one in which, even without ever hearing his name, I understood that some loves live precisely because they remain voiceless. To this day, I don't know his name. I carry every detail with me. The silent timbre of his gaze, the brief warmth of his hand, the symbolic weight of the apple, the rough touch of the blue handkerchief. But the sound of his name never pierced the air between us. It's as if fate had decided this would be the final frontier, the limit I could never cross. In the years after the war, I tried to imagine what it would be like to call him. I invented names, tested syllables in my mouth like someone trying keys in locks that never open. None of them sounded right. Perhaps because none of them were, in fact, his. And deep down, I realized that it didn't matter. What we had lived didn't need a label or official record to exist. Sometimes on warm New Orleans nights I sit on the porch and let the breeze carry memories like one carrying old messages. At those times I smell the ether mixed with the distant sweetness of the apple again, and it's as if he were sitting there, silent, across the table. We don't exchange words as we always did. Just the look, the same one that met me in the narrow hospital corridor, and never let go. I've come to understand over time that perhaps the truest love is precisely the one never spoken aloud. Because words can be distorted, forgotten, misinterpreted. But silence keeps everything intact, protected from the wear and tear of the world. And so, I go on, living with the memory of a man whose name I've never heard, but who taught me, without saying anything, that there are encounters that don't need to be complete to last forever. And if there's one thing I've learned from this story, it's that what's left unsaid can carry as much weight as, or even more than, what's said. If I've learned anything from this story, it's that silence also has memories. It seeps through the years, settles in the corners of the soul, and remains there, intact, even when everything else fades. I carried his silence like someone carrying an unopened letter, heavy but impossible to throw away. There was no reunion at the pier, no letter answered, no promise fulfilled. There was just a look, a piece of apple, a blue handkerchief, and a photo where I was out of focus, and yet seen. Perhaps that's what hurts the most, knowing that, for a moment, I was seen in a way no one else will. Today, when the Louisiana heat clings to my skin and the smell of the river mingles with the scent of clean curtains, I close my eyes and imagine him here, sitting in silence. I don't try to invent words for him. I let him be as he always was, a nameless presence, a love without confession. Because in the end there are things that survive precisely because they were unsaid. And what we had was exactly that. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever experienced a love you could never say out loud? I want to know. And if you want to hear more stories that don't deserve to be forgotten, like this video and subscribe to the channel.